The Supreme Court is set to hear an underreported but essential case that could fundamentally alter the role agencies like the EPA play in public life. Relentless Inc. versus the Department of Commerce puts the question of how much deference judges and lawmakers should give to supposed expert agencies like the EPA in drafting and executing policy related to their field. This is known as Chevron doctrine. In this specific case, the question is whether the National Marine Fisheries Service can force commercial fishing vessels to pay for some of the costs of placing federal regulators on their boats.
The real heart of this case is whether the Supreme Court should overrule the Chevron doctrine, which is the legal framework that courts have followed since 1984. In particular, the Chevron doctrine says that where there is an issue of statutory interpretation and Congress's intent is clear from the text, structure, and purpose of the act, naturally courts should do what Congress says. But it also says that if Congress's intent is unclear, if the statute is ambiguous, courts should defer to agency interpretations so long as that interpretation is reasonable.
Why is the court considering overruling this now?
Over the years, there have been a number of critics and supporters of the Chevron doctrine, and in recent years, a number of those critics are also Supreme Court justices. For example, Justice Gorsuch has questioned the constitutionality of Chevron ever since he was a judge on the 10th Circuit. He argues that it is fundamentally the province of courts to say what the law is, and that Chevron makes it too easy for courts to simply find ambiguity in text and then defer to government agencies. He and others argue that it systematically tilts the power in a case in favor of the government and allows judges to abdicate their responsibility to engage in vigorous statutory review.
Some view this as a conservative attempt to give power to a friendly judiciary and out of the hands of federal bureaucrats who may not be aligned with their views.
Here to discuss more about how this case might affect her industry is Meghan Lapp, Fisheries liaison at Seafreeze Limited, who are involved in the case. Meghan, welcome to Rising.
Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So why don't you start by walking us through the regulation that's at stake here? My understanding is that basically when you go out to fish, specifically for herring, you have to have a government monitor on board who is supposed to report back on basically how many fish are in the ocean that day. But recently, they've actually been requiring your ships and your companies to pay for the pleasure of having that monitor on board.
Yes, that's correct. The federal law has stated for decades, and for decades we've taken federal fisheries observers. Like you said, those observers are on board our vessels to monitor catch as well as to take biological sampling that's used in fisheries science. And, you know, we're not arguing that. We have done it for decades. What this regulation that we're challenging is the government decided that it wanted to put more of these on our vessels. And so these new observers, or at-sea monitors, as they're called, they don't do anything biological. All they do is essentially enforcement. The federal government decided, well, Congress didn't give them enough money to do this. So instead of getting the money from Congress like normal federal agencies do, that the vessels would have to pay themselves. And actually for our vessels, the cost of these enforcement agents on our boats to us would be 20% of the return to owner on a trip. So imagine somebody coming to you and saying, we're going to take 20% of your paycheck. You know, that's not sustainable.
Can you detail what that really looks like cost-wise? Where's the money going towards that, is funding the presence of these enforcers and regulators on the vessels? And how does that amount to 20%? Can you clue us in on those figures? It seems a big part of the case is that, this threatens the cost of doing business almost prohibitively.
Yeah, essentially the government has estimated that the cost of these monitors on board the vessel is $700 a day. And that goes to the salary of that enforcement agent. And so it's essentially we're paying out of pocket for the salary of a government enforcement agent at $700 a day. That's going to be more money than the crew on the boat make per day. And that's a huge problem. And I think one of the main points is that the law actually does allow, in 3 very specific instances, for vessels to pay the costs of observers. And those are 3 very, very narrow instances, none of which apply to this regulation in this case. And when Congress drafted those 3 very narrow exceptions, they actually capped how much of a percentage of the profits or the income of the trip that could constitute. And they capped it at around 2%. So 2% is not 20%. And so what you really see here is this particular regulation not only is outside of those 3 very narrow exceptions, it's also astronomically more burdensome on the industry than what Congress did allow for in those 3 exceptions.
Let's
Sorry,
talk a
just
little.
really quickly.
Go ahead.
If is it 2% of the overall revenue generated and then 20% of the profit? Is that how those numbers work out?
The 2% only applies to the 3 or to one of the 3 instances that Congress does allow it for. And I'd have to reread the law for the exact language there, but it's 2%. What the current regulation that we're contesting is 20%.
So let's
And that's
talk
a profit or revenue?
I have to, the return to owner is what we are talking about in our case. And I'd have to go back to see the exact language, but it is comparable. You could definitely speak to our attorneys about that.
So a little bit on the Chevron deference issue here. Basically, what this does is it gives a lot of authority to federal agencies to interpret law, and the courts basically have to defer to them if they believe that their interpretation of the law is reasonable, even if the plaintiff says that their interpretation is more reasonable or their interpretation is consistent with what Congress meant when they passed this law. I think the problem that I have with Chevron deference is that it suggests that these government agencies are experts on all of these issues that they're regulating on. Can you talk to us a little bit more about how specifically this affects your industry, the potential disruptions that this could have to fishermen and fisherwomen because of the EPA deciding that they are the experts on the sustainability, essentially, of your industry?
Well, so the regulation that we're talking about is actually issued by NOAA, not the EPA. But
thanks for clarifying.
This issue of, yeah, no problem. This issue of agency expertise, you know, what we're talking about in this particular instance has absolutely nothing to do with agency expertise. This isn't like, you know, NOAA is doing fisheries science or any type of thing that requires expertise. All that this case is talking about is who foots the bill. That's not something about agency expertise. That's NOAA didn't get the money that it wanted from Congress to do what it wanted to do. So normally that's called the power of the purse, and it means that the agency then can't do what they didn't get funded to do. In this particular instance, what they did was they said, well, Congress didn't give us the money, so we're going to make these people pay for it. And, you know, think about the application of that in any agency regulating any industry or any individual in the country. Think about the broad implications of that. If that were to be the case in your industry or, you know, in your personal, you know, life, think about what that could mean. And I think that it definitely is a problem. As far as for our industry, the government wins pretty much all the time. If there's a case contesting anything, because of the Chevron deference, I believe in the district or the circuit that we're in, like 90% of the time, the government wins. So the government can do what it wants, and it knows that it's going to win the case. So they're not afraid of you know, citizens. They're not afraid of small businesses. They're not afraid of anybody contesting them, because all they have to do is invoke the Chevron deference, and it's an automatic win to the agency. And that's also, you know, that's bad practice That's not good for the citizens of the United States. And I think that actually, if something like this, if a legal doctrine like this existed in another country, I think the United States would look at it and say, well, that's, you know, that's very authoritative. That takes, power away from the citizens. That's very undemocratic. But because it's here, it's been allowed to go on for a very long time.
It's my understanding that, this fishing charter, the Atlantic Herring Monitoring Program, intends to reduce overfishing, which has traditionally been a problem in the industry. It threatens environmental stability in the ecosystem in the region and the longevity of the potential to fish, herring in future years. And the charter seemingly requires just 50% of vessels to have the monitors on board, and the figure cited of $710 per day is actually an estimate by the companies that it would take up 20%, not the government. So I want to be very clear about that. So they're required to pay for some of the cost of observers on their boats. Some boats would then also have to have, enforcement on, in addition to just observers. Now, are those ships that have had problems complying with the monitors being on board in the past? Is that why enforcers are, required to be on board as well? Is it your view that this charter actually has reduced overfishing?
Actually, that's all very incorrect. The fact of the matter is that this particular regulation, even if it were not to exist, the fishery is still very sustainably managed. We have federal fisheries law that requires that all fisheries in the United States of America prevent overfishing. This has nothing to do with that. This does not have anything to do with preventing overfishing. Every fishery stock in the United States of America has what's called a fisheries management plan. Actually, fisheries in the United States are the 7th most regulated industry in the nation. We are more regulated than pharmaceutical manufacturing, and we are more regulated than oil and gas extraction. And that was done, those figures came out of a George Mason University study. So we are already spatially regulated. We are already, there's a lot of regulatory paperwork that fishermen and fishing industry folks have to do. We already have government ankle bracelets on all of our boats called vessel monitoring systems. The government knows where we are at all times, how fast we're going. They can see us, essentially. We already take federal fisheries observers on board our boats when we are chosen to do so. We already can be boarded by the Coast Guard at any time, with or without, cause or anything like that. They can board our vessels. There's not even enough time for me to go into all of the regulations that we already abide by that ensure sustainable fisheries management in this country. This regulation does not impact that in any way. That 20%, that was done, that is in the federal government documents, that is in the analysis that was done during the development of the regulation. So the government said this is going to affect 20% of the return to owner. But the fact of the matter is, I think it's very unfortunate a lot of the times when this regulation is painted as, well, if this regulation is not in effect, then, it's going to be detrimental to the resource or the environment. And that's absolutely not true. We already have a plethora of environmental regulations that ensure the sustainability of this resource. And actually, federal law requires and has required for decades that all fisheries management plans in the U.S. prevent overfishing. That's not an option. You have to do that. And so this regulation has nothing to do with that. What this regulation does is it makes the fishing industry unsustainable. The resource is sustainably managed. But what this regulation does is it makes the people that harvest that resource and bring it to people on land not sustainable. So, there are other requirements in the law that say, that when drafting regulations, the federal government has to consider the sustained participation of fishing communities in a fishery. And that was really just not done here.
Great. We're almost out of time, Meghan, but just really briefly, if you could, in like 30 seconds, can you talk a little bit about what the qualifications are for these government monitors? I mean, my understanding is that these people have maybe a week's worth of training. A lot of them have never even been on a boat before. I mean, what qualifies them to be responsible for supposedly watching what you're doing and seeing that what you're doing is consistent with regulations?
I believe they only require a GED. At-sea monitors don't require like a marine biology degree or anything like that. They have a high school diploma and they are trained for maybe 2 weeks. And you're right, they don't need to have at-sea experience. They don't even have to have marine biology experience to do this job.
Thanks so much for joining us, Meghan. We appreciate you. More rising after this.
Thank you.